As part of my weekly spiritual reflection, I consult various oracles like any good Unitarian Universalist. One of those is the Revised Common Lectionary. This is a scheduled portion of Scripture, scheduled out, used by many Christian preachers to ground their sermons, resulting in a potentially synchronized message across distance. Now, I love the Revised Common Lectionary because it means a mother in Kentucky and her daughter in North Carolina can both discuss the sermon that week. And the more you come to know me, you'll hear my own longing for something like the lectionary for UUs, so we all might be theologically synchronous, at least in some small way. We will see. At any rate, I could not help but notice this week's scripture passage is all about leadership transition from one prophet to the next. All the tension and anxiety potentially contained within that transition. I mean, sometimes the Bible really does speak directly to you in your time of need. In this week's portion from Hebrews, we have two partner leaders. They have been called to be prophets in a whole new way. It's a little murky how they're different from all the other prophets before them, but we just trust they are different. They perform healings. They operate outside of the traditional system of prophets. They're kind of like the Blues Brothers of prophets, on a mission from God, on a mission from God. I am from Chicago. Until God decides to remove the elder, Elijah, by elevating him up in a chariot to Cleveland. I mean, heaven. leaving the other prophet, the younger prophet, Elisha, on the ground, nervously requesting Elijah to bequeath his spirit to him, but to double it. So he says, Elijah, before you go, leave me your spirit, but leave me double your spirit. I'm going to need all that. Seems Elisha is wrestling with his own legitimacy. Although, rest assured, by the end of the passage, he performs a powerful miracle in his own right and goes on to a smooth leadership transition. So thanks, Bible. Imagining this moment with you, where I would take on a new mantle with you, I think it's time for us to consider our habits, the patterns of our behavior, the patterns we have established as a faith community, and how, in some ways, we have found ourselves deeply resilient and dynamic, but in other ways, we have dug our heels into an old story or a narrative of how things are done around here. I want to invite you to consider how on this 50th anniversary of Stonewall riots, we can be inspired by the queer community, the LGBTQ community, to release the habits that no longer serve us, to die, as the poet suggests, and build a new world inside our bodies in order to repair the outside world. To reflect on our habits and transform ourselves, blooming how we must, wild and free. The powers that be would have us habitually accustomed to certain realities. But we know we must not allow forced incarceration of migrant children alone in detention camps become a habit. And we must not allow criminal prosecution of women for exercising bodily autonomy become a habit to us. We must not allow white supremacy, the subjugation of women, and the murder of transgender people on our streets to become a habit. Some of our habits are toxic to us personally, to our ability to thrive, develop, and grow. The good news is any habit can be reshaped with time and effort. And of course, not all habits are bad. Some habits are life-affirming and enriching to ourselves, to the world. New York Times journalist Charles Duhigg, in his seminal 2012 book, The Power of Habit, deconstructs and analyzes a habit. His framework is and I realize I should have made this into a power presentation. Identify the routine, experiment with rewards, isolate the cue, the trigger, have a plan. Identify the routine, experiment with rewards, isolate the cue, have a plan. MIT researchers discovered a neurological loop at the heart of every habit: a cue, a routine, a reward. And for all of us, when our lives are upended, in crisis, habits can be a way of grounding ourselves and taking care of ourselves. Duhigg does not necessarily acknowledge this, but I have certainly observed this in individuals and communities and in myself. Now, I have never been a soldier. I may not know the fog of war, but I do know the fog of early motherhood with twins. Birthing twins 4 years ago in the heat wave of a Manhattan summer was the most cataclysmic event of my life. There was simply no way to prepare for the shifting tectonic plates of daily existence. Suddenly, I was on their schedule entirely, eating, sleeping, surviving only for their survival. My life was no longer my own. Trapped in a top-story apartment in a Brooklyn brownstone, I finally, 6 weeks in, managed to escape one blazing hot day after the mid-morning nursing session. Feeling strung out that day on sleep depression and shell-shocked overwhelm, I wandered up the streets, up the slope of Park Slope, a couple of blocks, till I found myself at the 7th Street Donut Pub. No, it is the 7th Avenue Donut Pub. Now, I've never tasted better donuts than I did that day for only 75 cents each. Well, the next day, what do you think I did? Right after the morning nursing session, I announced I was going on a walk. Guess where I ended up that day? Well, the third day, it was no different. The fourth day, I became giddy, looking forward to my moment of bodily freedom, finally, my chance to connect with the real world out there and remind it I still existed. A couple of weeks in to this daily habit, I realized this was a full-blown donut habit. And I really couldn't reasonably sustain it. I started to feel sluggish. My energy lagged a few hours after donut time. And I desperately needed all my energy to feed and care for twin babies. I identified the cue, 10 a.m., and then the routine, walk up the street a few blocks the very same way always, never right and then up, but always up and then right. And the reward, donut. So I experimented with rewards. What was my true desire here? Was it a donut? So I had donuts delivered. This is Brooklyn. You can do this. Anything. But it wasn't the same feeling. I didn't quite get that satisfaction. So maybe it wasn't the donuts. Maybe it was the walk. I took a walk outside, this time up to the park and back. But that wasn't quite it either. I did not feel that satisfaction. I felt the freedom, but not the whole satisfaction. So I found a new nearby destination, a juice shop. Every day, mid-morning, I took a walk alone, and I got a smoothie or a juice from the nearby juice shop. So I still felt like I was allowing myself a treat, only for me, not to be shared, and it was enough. Perhaps it's time for you to notice a habit of yours, something that you have used to get through a challenging time, and now it's time to pull it apart, to deconstruct it. What is my true desire? Now, this is the micro level, and this can help us transform our lives, but we also have habits at the macro level. And so how do they transform in collectives, in groups? This is a two-part answer. Recognizing small wins, peer pressure. According to Duhigg, it was the late 1960s when gay rights organizations started forcefully campaigning against homophobia. However, at this time, all their initial efforts yielded only a string of failures. They pushed to repeal laws that were used to prosecute gays and were roundly defeated in every state legislature. Teachers tried to create curricula to counsel gay teens this was back in the 60s, and they were fired for suggesting homosexuality should be embraced. It seemed like the ultimate goals of ending discrimination, police harassment, and convincing the American Psychiatric Association to stop defining homosexuality as a mental disease, it seemed those were out of reach. And then, in the early 1970s, the American Library Association's Task Force on Gay Liberation, of course it was the librarians, they decided to focus on one small, modest goal: convincing the Library of Congress to reclassify books about the gay liberation movement from Section 8. This is where we get really into library nerdiness, if you are into this. Section HQ 471, abnormal sexual relations, including sex crimes, and move it to another, less pejorative category. The Library of Congress received their letter and agreed to make the shift, reclassifying books into a new category, HQ 6.5, homosexuality, lesbian, gay liberation movement. It was a minor tweak of an old institutional habit regarding how books were shelved, but the effect was electrifying. The new policy spread across the nation. Gay rights organizations, citing this victory, started fundraising drives. Within a few years, openly gay politicians were running for office in California, New York, Massachusetts, Oregon, many of them citing the Library of Congress's decision as their inspiration. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association, after years of internal debate, rewrote the definition of homosexuality so it was no longer a mental illness, paving the way for the passage of state laws that made it illegal to discriminate against people for their sexual orientation. So we have the librarians to thank, in addition to the folks at Stonewall. Now, this is an example of Duhigg's small win, a small win. Now, these days, looking around feels like we are constantly assaulted by big losses. Are you with me? In times such as these, it can be difficult to notice the small wins. But people change their minds, and most importantly, they change their behavior because of small wins. We must look for the small wins, notice them, share them with each other, allow the small win to seep into the collective consciousness, transform our thinking. This is a time for noticing, sharing, and telling the stories of small wins, capital S, capital W, small wins, because they can change everything. The second way society changes its habits is through peer pressure, the social habits that encourage people to conform to group expectations. It's difficult to describe this because it varies from person to person, but the habits of peer pressure spread through strong social ties and weak social ties alike. They draw their authority from communal expectations. So you can see how a society can become peer pressured into accepting widespread, inhumane internment of migrant children trying to flee to safety. Society also can be peer pressured to actively oppose this. To counteract the communal expectation, we can create a new social habit in this area, and it's already beginning to take shape. Duhigg's example of how strong and weak ties can propel a movement brings us all the way back to summertime in 1964, when students from across the country, many of them white students from Harvard, Yale, Michigan, and other northern universities, applied for something called the Mississippi Summer Project. It was a 10-week program devoted to registering Black voters in the South, and it came to be known as Freedom Summer. Many who applied became aware it would be dangerous, and it was. A week after Freedom Summer began, white vigilantes killed 3 volunteer students outside of Longdale, Mississippi. The threat of harm kept many students from participating even after they applied. More than 1,000 applicants were accepted into Freedom Summer, but when it came time to leave, more than 300 of those stayed home. In the 1980s, a sociologist at the University of Arizona studied why people participated in Freedom Summer, while others withdrew. The applications were arduous. The application to get into Freedom Summer was complex, requiring multiple references and paperwork. This sociologist applied various hypotheses as to why some stayed home while others followed through, guessing at personal motivations. But personal motivations were disproved. That theory was disproved. Then he studied the applicant's opportunity cost, figuring those who stayed home had husbands or girlfriends, and that's what kept them from going down to Mississippi where they might face danger. But again, through interviewing, this hypothesis was proved wrong. He had one hypothesis left. Each applicant was asked to list their membership in student and political organizations, and at least 10 people they wanted to keep informed of their summer activities. And by comparing membership in clubs, the sociologist was able to determine which applicants had friends who also applied for Freedom Summer. That was the answer. The students were motivated against the odds of violence and danger by their social community and the thought of losing the respect of people who mattered to them. Those who dropped out, well, they also did so with the support of their friends who were in the same clubs and sports and schools. This knowledge is important to us in our summer of 2019 because it's time for another Freedom Summer. I will tell you, I am beyond disturbed at the massive state-sanctioned child abuse going on in detention centers. I am looking for the most impactful way to help change the national conversation, the conversation in Atlanta, or to hold our elected officials' feet to the fire of this unconscionable injustice. Now, this may require I take a trip to the border or some other kind of action. And it may be that I ask you to join me. We're going to need each other. Because we can change our collective habits, too. Our habits do not have to have power over us. We have the power, with our own two hands, to change. And the key ingredient, Charles Duhigg explores, the key ingredient to change is proactive planning. Make a plan. Make a plan for yourself, how you will change a habit that no longer serves you. Then visualize yourself changing the habit. So when I wanted to change my donut habit of 2015, I had to visualize myself walking up the street, going into the juice shop and doing that. And that's what led me. So then when I got the juice, that was my reward. I fulfilled my vision of how that would go. This is how Michael Phelps wins races, the Olympic swimmer. He wins races by planning and visualizing his outcome. This is how the Indianapolis Colts won the Super Bowl over the Patriots in the mid-aughts. This is exactly how I approach a daily spiritual practice. Plan it out. Visualize yourself doing it. As we at UUCA take up a new mantle of ministry together, this new phase of leadership for our congregation and for Atlanta. Like Elisha in the story from Hebrews, let our power and our spirit be amplified, times 2, doubled. We do not have to do things the way they have always been done. Not in our relationship habits, not in our individual personal habits, and not in our collective sense of how to do church. We can be a bold new thing for Atlanta. Now I have a choice, the poet writes. Repair a world or build a new one inside my body. A white door opens into a place queerly brimming, gold light so velvet gold. It is like the world hasn't happened. Bloom how you must. Wild until we are free. May it be so.